Well, let's pray first. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time. Thank you for this evening. Thank you for your word. Thank you for scriptures that speak to us. So I pray, Lord, that may I myself will be put aside and you take the center. And may you speak to us and open our hearts. In Jesus Christ's most precious name I pray. Amen. Well, I never thought I would be getting this mic. It's very interesting. Very strange, feels very difficult to move in certain ways. But let's see what happens. So, we have been going through the book of 1 Peter. Before we start going through the passage, let me just read the whole thing that I'm going to be preaching from today. So, if you can open your Bibles to 1 Peter 4, 1 to 6. 1 Peter 4, 1 to 6. And follow along as I read. Verse 1. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For the gospel for this purpose has been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. So that's our text for tonight. So 2 days ago, I ran into this article on Christianity Today, which was talking about how Donald Trump, wants released this executive order to strengthen federal laws, religious exemption in federal laws, because over the last 10 years, there have been increasing number of cases against Christian and religious institutions, cases against institutions that do not permit, same-sex marriages in their churches, or things like that. And there have been rapid increase in those kind of cases. Like even the Obamacare actually requires institutions to provide funding for contraceptions in schools, which is something very controversial and very not biblical. And so these kind of cases, for whoever has been opposing these, were increasing in the law courts. And so therefore, this bill was passed to strengthen religious exemption, that the religious organizations don't have to follow these strict rules. And because of all this increasing cases, International Christian Concern, which is an organization based in Washington, it monitors persecution of Christians around the world and fights for the rights of believers. It actually listed in 2016, for the very first time, it listed United States in the Hall of Shame for faith, for the very first time. And guess who else was in that list, along with the United States? Iraq, Syria, and North Korea. So imagine, just think of that. Iraq, Syria, and North Korea, and the persecution of believers that happens in these countries. And United States is actually included in that list for persecution of believers. But what kind of persecution? Constant attacks on media and marginalized through law. Now, if you think about it in your own lives, so we think of persecution as just physical persecution where Christians are being killed or slaughtered, but this is also kind of persecution that we face every day. It's more like an intellectual persecution or an emotional persecution where you are being made fun of or even ridiculed just for you being a Christ follower. I mean, how many times do you go to work and people are aware that you are a believer and then you're made fun of? Or in this present generation, some of you students here go to school, who are secular schools, and you being a believer is something that is like, oh, this guy is a believer, he's a Christian, that's We don't like it. How many times that happens? Or even at your workplaces. Oftentimes, let's say you may be good at your work and you are looking for a promotion or something like that, but you won't get it because you're a believer. And you don't practice things that the non-believers do. Probably you don't want to use any illegal ways to go ahead in life, right? And how many times that happened that you try to do things and you want things, but you're not going to get it because you're a believer. And all of this is part of this intellectual persecution as well. Or even if you look at media as well, let's say if you profess, how many times do we see debates everywhere where there is a believer and there's a non-believer, and you have to, the believers are watching their words and how they say things, but from the other side it's always constant attacks where they're saying all these bad words and you just stand there like, I have no idea what to do. All of this is also persecution because it affects you mentally and intellectually. So this is one of the reasons why ICC put US also in that list, because the increasing number of intellectual persecution that is happening in the United States. But the interesting part is, this is not new. The believers in the first century actually also went through the same thing. Of course, there was like a lot of persecution of believers where they're being slaughtered and everything, but this exact kind of persecution also was something that the people in Roman colonies and other Gentile nations also went through, where for their faith, they were being sidelined, where for their faith, they were being made fun of, and eventually for their faith, they were being killed as well. So this is exactly why the first letter of 1 Peter was also written to the believers. He says that diaspora who is dispersed in the Roman colonies, but the readers of this letter are actually Gentiles who were first Gentiles and are now changed by the blood of Christ and are believers now. So that's whom he's writing to. So we can relate to this letter too. We were first lost as well, and now we are found. So therefore, whatever is written in this letter is actually applies to us in this day as well, and very well. And so therefore, the believers in the Roman provinces were going through the same form of persecution. Actually, in the Roman culture was such a culture, it was very communal. So when somebody becomes a believer and becomes a part of the Christian community, they do not want to practice the things that the Roman community was practicing, because Roman practices were excessively vulgar and evil. So all the things that they would do and practice was just in excess. If they would drink, they would always have to drink in excess, and those kind of things. So and of course, once you become a believer, your life's transformed and you're not part of that. So therefore, you stay away from those colonies and those communities, which was actually, the Romans looked at it as a sign of evil. Because if you're in a Roman colony and you're not part of their community, that is a big offense for them. And the believers were not doing that. So therefore, these Romans looked at the believers and thought, oh, they're anti-nationalists and they're evil. And eventually it led to them being sidelined, being ridiculed, and eventually killed as well. So therefore, Peter is actually writing this letter, and he understands the situation that the readers are around in. And therefore, he gives you this lesson from our passage today, which is a lesson that I want you to take home to. And it's in the form of this question, which says, listen to me carefully. How should a believer respond to persecution from the unbelievers? How must a Christian react to opposition from a secular pagan society? To answer this question, I have three ways you can do that, so let's go into that. The first one, a believer should respond to persecution from unbelievers by emulating the resolve of Christ. In other words, a Christian must react to opposition from a secular or pagan society by imitating the mindset of Christ. Let's look at 1 Peter 4, verses 1 and 2. 1 Peter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. As you notice, the text says, therefore. Like Pastor Steve often says, if something says therefore, what is it there for, right? So you have to ask the question, it's therefore. What is it trying to say? It's therefore is a cue. Every time you read in the Bible and you see it therefore, it's a cue that it is explaining something that was said before. So the point is, in the entire book of 1 Peter, he's been explaining all this theology of suffering. Jesus Christ's suffering is a central theme. He's explaining that, exploiting that. And then in chapter 3, verse 18, he says, "For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit." This, therefore, is actually pointing to that. Since Christ did this, since Christ suffered in this flesh, to the point that he died on the cross, which is what he's referring back to. And therefore, he continues saying, verse 1 of chapter 4, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." So the word, very interesting keyword here is arm yourself, which is a very military type of word saying. You arm yourself. He's not saying be prepared. He's not saying take care. He's saying arm yourself, because he's trying to put this analogy that this is a battle that you're going to be facing. So if you're a believer and you're going out there, it's always going to be a battle. So therefore, you have to arm yourself. Don't take it lightly. This is not something that you just are. It is a war that you're in. If you follow Christ, the world is going to come against you. So therefore, arm yourself. But then the question is, arm yourselves with what? Arm yourselves also with the same purpose. The word here, purpose, can actually, it has to do with your cognitive thinking. So what it's trying to tell you is same purpose, intention, or resolve. It's telling you to arm yourselves, prepare your minds to be ready to face this battle, because this battle is inevitable. So what is this resolve, this purpose that Christ had? Because the second clause in the first verse, it says, "Because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." I don't think that it's a cause that if you do this, you will cease from sin. I think it's more like explaining what this resolve of Christ is. It's saying that a better translation would be also with the same purpose, that he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So let me explain what ceased from sin means. It does not mean that once you suffer, you stop sinning. Or if you follow Christ and become a believer, you stop sinning. That's not what it's saying. You can never stop sinning as long as you're in this flesh, because the flesh is corrupted to the core. But what it's trying to say is that those who are willing to go through this suffering, the suffering that you face for your faith, we need to clarify what the suffering is being referred to here. It's not just physical suffering where you're going through pain because you got hurt or something. This is the suffering that you go through because of your faith, because of whom you believe. So for this kind of a suffering, if anybody, a believer, is showing signs that he wants to go through this suffering, what it's trying to say is that is a major sign to tell you that he does not belong to sin anymore. That's what it's trying to say. When it says ceased from sin, that's what it means. That means this person does not belong to sin anymore. That means he has Christ in him. That means he's saved. That's what it means. So this is the same result that Christ had, in the sense, look at Jesus' story, right? Like, he went through so much suffering. When the time came from the Garden of Gethsemane in front of Pilate and everything, people were accusing him, spat on him, beat him, and eventually killed him on the cross. But he kept quiet. Not because he was scared or anything, because he knew why he's doing this. If he had retaliated, that would not have fulfilled the purpose. Because, like last week, Dom preached about Jesus' conviction. Jesus had a strong conviction that this is what I'm here for. This is my mission. This is my purpose, to preach the gospel and to glorify God the Father. That's what I'm here for. Therefore, whatever you are sending back at me or throwing back at me is not going to shake me, because I do not belong to sin. Jesus' work just finished sin and its power over our lives. So therefore, this is a sign that if you are a believer and you are willing to go through this suffering, that you face when you profess your faith to a non-believer or just outside world, and you're willing to go through that, that means it's a sign that you do not belong to sin, that you have ceased from sin. That's what it means. And what does this do? So in the next verse, it gives you the purpose for this, which starts as verse 2. So as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. So you are willing to go through this suffering, which shows that you do not belong to sin anymore. For this reason, that for the rest of your lives on earth, you're not going to live for sin anymore, but for the will of God. And that's the purpose. So therefore, if you emulate the resolve of Christ, the ultimate purpose is that you're going to be living for God's will and not for your former sins. So let me give an illustration of how it looks like in a person's life. Does anybody has heard the story of Graham and Gladys Staines? So Graham and Gladys Staines were these missionaries living in India, so around in the 90s. In 1999, so Graham and Gladys Staines had two children, Philip and Timothy. So Graham Staines and his two children, they were in one of the eastern states in India, and from the city that they were living in, 4 hours away, they went to this village nearby to preach the gospel there. And there was this anti-Christian mob that found them in the car and burned them alive. So Gladys Staines at the time was in her home 4 hours away, and she was home, and she had just heard this news that in this village that her husband and her children went to, there's something that happened to believers who was burned there. And it was 7:30 in the morning on January 23rd, 1999, and she was roaming around in her house, worried about what's happening. And all the people who knew her just came to her house to support her. Like, it's gonna be fine. And around 9 a.m., she finally got the news of confirmation that yes, it was her husband and her two children. And people were asking, now what shall we do? This is such a tragedy, right? And these were her words: we will forgive them. Here is one of the quotes from Gladys Staines regarding this forgiveness that she is really famous for. It's like, of those who murdered her husband and boys, she said, I can forgive their deeds, but I cannot forgive their sins. Only Jesus can forgive their sins, and they will have to ask. One of the news reporters asked, once the case was filed and the trial happened, and once the case was resolved, one of the news reporters asked her, so regarding this, what are your thoughts on those who are convicted? How are you feeling? This was her response. I forgive the other because I have received forgiveness from Jesus Christ. I have encountered the presence of Jesus in my life, and this is the spirit I share. When we forgive, there is no bitterness. We live our lives and continue the task entrusted to us with His grace and peace. All Christians who have known the intervention of Jesus in their lives will have this gift to forgive and to be the witness of His peace and presence. Support them with your solidarity and prayers. So that was her response regarding this tragedy where she lost her husband and her two children because of a mob who wanted to kill them. So just imagine, put yourself in her shoes and see, how would you respond? It's kind of impossible to think that you would be okay to forgive something like that if your own loved one was burned alive because of their faith. But then where does she get the strength to say that I forgive them? And then she makes sure that she's clear that I forgive the deeds, but only God can forgive their sins if they turn to Him. I think she is like a prime example of what it means to emulate the resolve of Christ. This is, I think, probably what Jesus would have responded as well. So therefore, this is the application for you guys from this particular 2 verses. It is not easy to forgive something like this. I'm not saying most of you are not even going to face something like this in your lives. The persecution that we face in every day is relatively much, much, much smaller. But at the same time, when we go out there, we are going to face a lot of opposition just because we are believers. So we need to emulate the resolve of Christ, the mindset that if I am willing to go through this suffering, it shows that I am a believer and I'm dead to sin. And I am willing to go through this suffering. But how do you do this? There are a few practical things that you can do. For example, we as a church are going to go through reading through the book of Luke and Acts, the Gospel and Acts, through this Lent season. So as you're reading through these books, focus on those passages which talk about Jesus' suffering. If you want to emulate the resolve of Christ and how he handled suffering, you need to know what he suffered and what his response was in those sufferings, right? So therefore, as you're reading through these passages, mark them down. I would rather say actually have a book or a journal or something and write those verses down where you see somebody doing something against Jesus and how did Jesus react. Write them down. It doesn't have to be a whole chapter, just a few verses of how Jesus responded. Memorize those. Have them, print them out somewhere, put them on the wall, maybe on the desktop somewhere, so that you know that you're constantly reminded of this is how Jesus responded to suffering. And let's say if something happens, you have it in your mind and you know Jesus responded this way, therefore I should respond this way as well. All right, so one way to respond to persecution from unbelievers is to emulate the resolve of Christ. But there's more. What is the next way? Number 2. A believer should respond to the persecution from unbelievers by expecting opposition from the unbelievers in the first place. It's kind of redundant, but yes, it's good to enforce it. A Christian must react to opposition from a secular pagan society by anticipating hostility from a pagan society. Let's look at verses 3 and 4 of chapter 4. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. So you can see from verse 3 that it says the time that you spent as Gentiles doing all these things is past. So it's kind of trying to tell you more about the audience that Peter is writing this letter to. They were Gentiles who were participating in all these things that were listed, and now they changed, right? So now they do not participate in drunkenness, they do not participate in carousing, drinking parties, and abominable practices. The English does not carry the strength of what he's trying to say enough, but having pursued a course of sensuality is actually a really strong word in the Greek. It actually means excessive craving for anything. Anything that they would do would be in excess. For example, for pleasure, first of all. They would participate in violent acts for pleasure as well. That is what gladiators are for, by the way. And so many other things. So like the abominable idolatries refers to, so there was a lot of ritual pagan temple worship, and in those temple worships, having orgies, drinking parties, killing things was actually part of ritual worship, which was done in excess. And these Gentiles were once participating in those things, and then they changed. And Peter is trying to tell them, your past life is your past. It's not the same anymore. You do not belong to that anymore. And in this verse 4, it says, in all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. So it's like you are part of this community who was into all of these things, and now, because of Jesus, you're changed. So of course, you do not want to participate in all those things. And therefore, when you see such a person, when you go back to your friends and they're like, hey, I did not see you there, we were doing this, we were doing that. So they are surprised that you do not participate with them. And because of that, they will actually make fun of you. The text is as simple as that. So all the text is trying to say, hey, if you follow Jesus, people are going to make fun of you. It's not a surprise. Don't take it as a surprise. If you are following Jesus, don't be surprised if somebody throws a cuss word at you, or just makes fun of you, or just pulls your leg or something, or even worse than that. These things are bound to happen, so expect them. Don't act as surprised. If you are a believer and you're going out there in the world and everybody likes you, something's wrong. You're doing something wrong. See, I think you should check your lives. Because if you are a believer and there is not even a single person opposing you, something's definitely wrong. So probably we need to actually focus, am I actually living a believer's life in the first place? Because if you are a believer, people are going to make fun of you or oppose you in any way. So therefore, I'll give you an illustration. So I come from India, and I used to go to this Christian missionary school. And schools in India are very formal. We all have uniforms, we have ties and everything. So I had this group of friends, acquaintances, and they were like the rowdy gang of the school, who, if the teacher would ask you to wear the tie, they would have the tie all the way up till here, and open buttons all the way up till here, with one of the shirts things untucked over here, with a belt all the way over there. And these were the ones who would do all sorts of pranks in the school. All right, so there was this one guy, he became a friend of mine eventually, but he was the one who was hesitant because he knew that whatever these guys are doing is actually not right. So once what happened was, they went to the principal's office and they threw a firecracker in his office and ran away. So of course the school's not going to keep quiet, right? But nobody was able to figure out who is this guy that did it, right? Like who did this? And for a couple of months they were trying to figure out, that was an interesting time in school. They were trying to figure out who are these kids, let's find them out, and because they were going to suffer severe consequences for that, you can't do that. So there was this guy, the guy who eventually became my friend, he was always hesitant to participate in these things. So he actually, after that incident, he left them. He was like, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to be part of this anymore. And the next day onwards, you can see he changed his lifestyle. He had his tie all the way up till here, shirt tucked, the belt was in the right place, and he started studying. And 2 months passed by, and then eventually the school officials, the principal and everybody, they found out who were the people who did this, and they expelled them. They brought all of them to the principal's office, but this guy, the guy who changed, they found out that, okay, he was also part of this. He was also part of the gang when they actually threw this firecracker in my office. But you can see over the last 2 months, he has repented and he's changed. He's not a part of them. So they let him be. But the other group, they expelled. So this is how this group was actually making fun of this guy too. Like, hey, you used to be a part of us. Now what happened? You're a coward now. You're not a part of us. And this is what we're supposed to do. And now you're all this nice guy. That's not really you, right? But look what happened. So this guy knew what was right and wrong. He realized that he was guilty. He changed his ways and he did not participate. He was fine. But this other group, they were expelled. So this is something that is going to happen to us too as you go out there. And so how can you apply this particular lesson? First of all, if you want to face opposition from unbelievers, first of all, you need to profess the gospel to them. So the first application would be, go out there and be a Christian. If you're not doing that, well, you'll not face any opposition, but then you will face judgment. So, hey, that's what the text says, I'll get there eventually. So the first application would be, go out there and live as a Christian. Realize what it means to be a Christian in an unbelieving world and go out there and do that. And once you face opposition, don't be scared, don't be afraid that I don't want to, my boss is saying this to me, I do not want to participate in this, I don't want to say anything about my faith because I don't want him to think any less of me or make fun of me or even fire me. It's fine. If somebody says something, be happy actually, because your mind should be in the right place where it says that, hey, somebody actually made fun of me because I'm a believer. That means I'm doing something right. Therefore, I will get a reward in heaven. Think of it in those ways. So consider it as joy if somebody is opposing you for your faith. So in fact, one of the practical ways you can do this, in that journal which I mentioned in the previous point, let's say if somebody makes fun of you or does something against you because you profess your faith, go home, write that story down, and pray. Lord, this happened. It made me feel angry, but I'm going to pray and give thanks to you because it's a sign that I am living the way you asked me to live. And one day, everything will be fine. It's fine. So take it as something to be happy if somebody makes fun of you for your faith or somebody opposes you for your faith, because it is going to happen. So let's go to point number 3. The third way how a believer should respond to persecution from unbelievers is by trusting God with the vindication of our lives. I'll repeat that in other words. A Christian must react to opposition from a secular pagan society by trusting in the Lord for executing justice for us. Let's read verses 5 and 6. It says, "But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God." So it says, "But they will give account to him." The they he's talking about is those people, the Gentiles who are maligning the Gentile converts. That is the unbelievers. So, and he uses interesting phrasing. It says, they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So this phrase is a common ancient Near Eastern phrase, living and the dead, which means all people. So what he's trying to say, one day a judge will be there. He's ready to judge every single person that existed, even you, and even those who are about to come. And they will give, every person is going to give an account to him. And then verse 6 it says, "For the gospel has for this purpose been preached, even to those who are dead." So let me explain what the dead here really means. This is not like there are a lot of people who think that this is like, oh, Jesus went to Hades and preached to the people who are dead and in hell. This is not that. What he's trying to say is, the gospel was preached, these people were alive when they heard it and are now dead. It's not even talking about spiritually dead. It's talking about literal physical death, but it's talking about those people who were once alive, heard the gospel, may or may not have responded, and are now dead. That's what it means. So for this reason, the gospel has been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. So therefore, those who heard the gospel, when they were alive then, they may have responded accepting Jesus and are now dead. They will also be judged when Jesus comes back. And the world, so what Peter is actually trying to tell you here is, so the believers that he's writing to, the Gentile converts, like, yes, those who were alive were already facing persecution from non-believers. But also the ones who were dead, they were actually being made fun of too. It's like the unbeliever trying to say, hey, look, you followed this good Christian life, you gave up all these things, and look, you're dead now. You know, your family is dead, they're all gone. Because the Roman pagan culture teaches you, their religions do not teach you anything about afterlife. They do not teach you the importance of being judged after death. In the sense, there is no accountability in their religion. So once you're dead, you're gone. It's fine. There may be afterlife in some form, but not in this way. And therefore, the Christian teaching that, hey, you may die now, but there is still a lot to come after this. This is just the beginning, is very offensive to them and very contradictory to their religion. So, and if you're a believer, you are going to share to people about Jesus and also about eternal life, whether you're going to have it or not, right? So that's exactly what the believers in the letter were also doing, and therefore they were being opposed, they were being made fun of, they were persecuted, and even they were the loved ones who received Jesus and have died now were also being made fun of. They were like, hey, look, you believed all these things, you did all these things, and you died. Why not just enjoy? That's the mindset. So Peter is now here trying to tell you that yes, they are dead, and though they were judged in the flesh, it means as men. So it's like, yes, in this world, when they were alive, they were judged a certain way by these Roman pagans, but they will be judged in a completely different way in the spirit when I come back. That is judged by God. So therefore, it's trying to tell you, hey, the world will judge you in a certain way. It applies to us too. In our lives right now, because you do not participate with the unbelievers in the things that they do, the world will judge you, the world will make fun of you, the world will think of a certain way. They will, how many times do we hear a Christian being called a bigot? The world will judge you in a certain way. But don't be afraid. Do not lose any hope. Because one day the judge of the living and the dead will come. And the way he judges is much different. And therefore, Peter is encouraging the believers to have this hope that one day the judge of living and dead will come. And the way he is going to judge is completely different, where we will be alive with him eternally. That's what he's trying to say. So an illustration for this is, I used to watch this TV show, I forgot the name of it. So it was like officials or CEOs of companies would dress in a disguise and go to the companies and see how their workers work. I forgot the name of the show. So there was this one episode that I saw where this guy, he was like the CEO and the topmost authority, right? He heard stories about his own workers and his own company. So one day he put on all this makeup, like a professional makeup artist came, and just this guy. He did not look anything like how he used to look. And then he goes to his company as a new hire for people to train him, right? So he goes there, and his whole sole purpose is to find out who works how do they do things, let me evaluate my own people, right? Because if you bring them to your office and ask them questions, everybody's going to lie. So let me see what the reality is. So he goes there, and there were a whole different kinds of people. Some people were so welcoming, some just did not pay any attention. And then through his investigation of his own company, he found out there was a group of people that were doing things the wrong way. In fact, they were into illegal practices, selling stuff from that company to the black market at a much higher rate, making profits and saying that this is fine. And he found that out. But there were other people too who were like sincere. Like there was this janitor in that company, and he was the most sincere janitor he ever found. Never into anything wrong, always faithfully coming in, punching in on time, leaving off on time, making sure everything is done right. And that he notices all this. And yes, once the day ends, in front of everybody, every person of the company is gathered, and then he removes his makeup, and everybody's like, and especially those who are into all the wrong stuff. Guess what happened to them? They were fired. And this janitor was given if I'm right, he was given a different position with a much higher pay and all those kind of things, and he had a happy life. But that's the point. The judge that we serve does not have to disguise himself. He sees everything. He just looks down from up there, and he can see everything. He already knows everything, and he's watching you right now as you're sitting in these pews as well. He knows every single thought that you had. He knows every single thing that you did. And therefore, he is going to judge you for everything that you do. So therefore, have this hope. The application for us is have this hope that you do not belong to sin anymore, that you belong to Christ. And therefore, if the world is judging you a certain way, it's fine. Keep persevering, keep pressing on, because one day, God will come back, and those who made fun of you will also give an account to him for what they did. This is a very significant theme through the entirety of this letter, where Peter is asking them to live according to God's way, but at the same time submit to your government. In chapter 2, that's one of the things he says, right? So Peter's encouragement to us today is also the same. It's like, hey, live as if you're living for God, but at the same time, don't completely disconnect from the society. Because hey, if you had to profess the gospel to somebody, then you have to go out there. You can't profess the gospel by staying in this walls here. So you have to go out. But at the same time, do not participate, do not be influenced by worldly things as well. And since you're going to go out there and live like a believer, people are going to oppose you, people are going to make fun of you, but it's fine. Take that as a sign. It's a positive sign if people are doing that, because you're doing something right, and one day Lord will come back, and for all the good that you did, all the life that you lived for Him, He's going to vindicate you. There will be justice for you. You will be judged in the Spirit, and you will live eternal life with Him. But then those who made fun of you, those who mocked you, they're going to be accountable for their actions. So there is hope. So do not lose heart in that. So in conclusion, the three things that we learned today from this lesson, which was how should a believer respond to persecution from unbelievers? The first was by emulating the resolve of Christ. That is by imitating His mindset. All right? The second one, by expecting opposition from unbelievers. By, anticipating any form of hostility from unbelievers. And third, by trusting God with the vindication of your lives. That is, by trusting the Lord in executing justice for us. But at the same time, I would also want you to think of this. If you did not surrender your life to Christ right now, like the last two verses says, in verses 5 and 6, the God, the one who judges the living and the dead, will come. And you are going to be accountable for everything that you did and said to Him. But if you did accept Jesus, you will be judged in the Spirit. That means your life is redeemed and that you belong to Him and you will have eternal life. Therefore, the question that I would want to ask you is, do you want to be accountable for all the actions that you did and be judged in the Spirit or in the flesh? It's as simple as that. So with that, I will leave the thought in your mind and invite Pastor Steve up here.